Maybe you should use a script for your podcast. In this episode of Podcastification, how to figure all that out. My name is Kerry Green, and I am the client happiness guy at podcastfasttrack.com, and this is Podcastification. This show is all about podcasting. How to do it, how not to do it, best practices, interesting news items that have to do with the realm of podcasting, and who knows what else. And I'm trying to do it all with a little bit of fun and some information to help you get a show going, keep yours going, or make it better. And if you like what's going on here on the show, I would appreciate it, so appreciate it, if you could leave a rating or review on iTunes. You can find out how to do that at podcastfasttrack.com/review. That's enough of that kind of stuff. Let's get you podcastificated right away. When I was 8 years old, I didn't know anything about a podcast script. I mean, come on, podcasting didn't even exist back then. But that's when I first learned what a script was. It was in my first real play. It was a drama at my church. They were putting it on, and somehow I got the lead children's part. To me, the script was like a roadmap. It was a very clear outline of exactly what was going to happen in the play. You know, who does what, when, who stands where, who says what, and when they say it. Can you imagine what it would be like if you tried to put on a drama but didn't have a script? How would the actors know what it was all about? How would they know how to act in conjunction with each other? How would they know where the play was headed? You see, for a play, a script is a must-have. But what about for your podcast? Should you use a podcast script? There's a lot of debate about whether podcasts should be scripted, and I understand why. Everybody has their own idea what makes for a good podcast. But I think you and I should approach the issue from an entirely different angle. Whether or not you use a podcast script has nothing to do with what will make your podcast good or bad. It depends solely on the purpose of your podcast. Let's look at a handful of podcast types, different ways people do podcasts, to see if a podcast script would be helpful in each of those cases. Okay, let's start with what I call the laid-back podcast. There are shows out there that are intended to be informal. They're laid back, they're easygoing. Often there are a couple of hotshot hosts who banter back and forth. They make it for fun, and there's a relaxed atmosphere to the show. There's a certain appeal to those shows because they tend to be more entertaining. If a show like that may feel like it doesn't have much structure, but you can be sure they're at least going by an outline, but not a script. That sort of loose direction allows for the free-flowing nature of the show that listeners enjoy. So in that case, I don't necessarily think the script is warranted. How about the interview podcast? That's what we talked about last week in episode number 6. You can find the show notes for that at podcastfasttrack.com/006. Interview podcasts, you know about those. There's thousands of them out there. Somebody's featured as a guest, and someone else asks them questions. It's similar to the laid-back show in that the outline is in the questions the host asks the guests. Good interview shows benefit from the structure of the questions or the outline, while allowing for the flexibility that makes the show interesting and interactive. If you're doing an interview podcast, a script might be helpful, but could also serve like a straitjacket, making the show far too wooden and inflexible. But at the very least, you should have an outline, and that outline should be based on your questions. Okay, let's talk about the sales or lead generation podcast. Some of the podcasts out there are produced by a brand name or company in hopes that their show will generate leads or sales for the company. You know the kind I mean. They often cover information related to their product or their niche, and it includes a soft sell encouraging you to check out their product. Should that kind of a show use a script? I think that kind of a show could definitely benefit from a podcast script for these reasons. Just like a sales letter or a brochure, you'd want to make sure that you included the benefits of your product very clearly and persuasively. A script helps you do that. You want to ensure that you don't forget anything vital to the product that might induce a prospect to give it a whirl. Your script will help you do that. Your podcast, in that case, is serving as audio sales copy. Did you hear that? Sales copy. It needs to be crafted to persuade and convince, not spoken on a whim or off the cuff. A podcast script seems like a no-brainer for a sales podcast. And then there's what I would call the expert podcast. I don't know anyone who calls their show an expert podcast, but you know the kind I'm talking about. There's typically somebody teaching or coaching. They're passing along information the listener needs to know. Sometimes it's a monologue. You don't have interviews or guests. You just have one person talking. Sounds kind of like this show, doesn't it? They could do it in a straight info dump style or through Q&A segments. In my opinion, this is an ideal type of podcast to use a podcast script. Why? Well, because you're able to lay out your content and your teaching points accurately. You're able to say exactly what you want to say and exactly the way you want to say it. Word choice is perfect because it's planned. You're able to have exactly the impact you want to have because you're going about it intentionally. But you've got to be careful that you don't sound like you're reading the podcast script, even though you are. And this is going to help the audio be much more interesting and engaging, and guarantee you your listeners will appreciate it. So figure it out for yourself based on what type of podcast you're producing. You owe it to yourself and you owe it to your listeners. For the right kind of show, a podcast script can make the difference between sales and no sales, or a raving fan base and no fans at all. The folks over at Copyblogger have written a piece called 4 Copywriting Techniques for Engaging Podcasts. You can find the link to that in my show notes for this episode. That's at podcastfasttrack.com/007. If you want to learn how to write a great podcast script, those are the guys to teach you how. Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. This show is brought to you by Podcast Fast Track, where my team provides professional podcasting services without the time suck. Full production, editing, and show notes all in one monthly subscription package. You can find out more at podcastfasttrack.com. Now go out and make it a podcastificating day. You know, I don't know anybody who calls their podcast an Aspert podcast. Yeah, I hope they don't call it an Aspert podcast.